They called him the richest man in the world. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel empire for $480 million in 1901, the equivalent of over $300 billion today. He became the face of American philanthropy, giving away 90% of his fortune before he died. But the mansion he built at the peak of his power, Skibo Castle in Scotland, tells a different story. Because Carnegie didn't just give away his money. He gave away his identity. And what he got in return wasn't peace. It was irrelevance. This isn't about a man who lost his wealth. It's about a man who won everything, then discovered that winning had made him obsolete. Carnegie spent 50 years clawing his way to the top of American capitalism. And then he spent his final 20 years discovering that the systems he had built didn't need him anymore. The castle he retreated to wasn't a reward. It was an exile he designed himself. Let's start with what Carnegie actually built, because the scale is almost incomprehensible. He didn't inherit wealth. He started as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill making $1.20 a week. By 1901, he controlled 70% of America's steel production. His company produced more steel than all of Great Britain. He owned the railroads that transported it, the mines that supplied the ore, the ships that carried it across oceans. It wasn't just a business. It was a vertical monopoly that controlled the entire supply chain of the Industrial Revolution. And Carnegie didn't build it through innovation alone. He built it through ruthless cost control and labor suppression. The Homestead Strike of 1892 is the moment that defines him. His workers demanded better wages and safer conditions. Carnegie's response was to hire 300 Pinkerton agents, private military contractors, to break the strike with violence. 10 people died. The strike was crushed. And Carnegie's profits continued growing. But here's what most people miss. Carnegie wasn't at Homestead when the violence happened. He was in Scotland. At Skibo Castle. The estate he had purchased in 1897 as his summer retreat. He let his deputy, Henry Clay Frick, handle the massacre while he vacationed 4,000 miles away. And that distance, that ability to profit from violence without witnessing it, defined Carnegie's entire relationship with his wealth. If you're still watching, it's because you already sense where this is going. By 1901, Carnegie was 55 years old and exhausted. He had spent 3 decades fighting competitors, crushing unions, and expanding his empire. And J.P. Morgan offered him an exit. $480 million for Carnegie Steel. Carnegie accepted. And in that moment, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided to become a philanthropist. Not just a donor, a professional giver. He would spend the rest of his life giving away his fortune according to a philosophy he called the Gospel of Wealth. Here's the philosophy in simple terms. Carnegie believed that men like him, industrialists who had accumulated massive fortunes, had a moral obligation to redistribute that wealth before they died. Not through inheritance, which he thought created weak, entitled children. But through institutions. Libraries. Universities. Concert halls. Structures that would outlast him and bear his name forever. On paper, it sounds noble. But here's the mechanism nobody talks about. When Carnegie sold his company and committed to giving away his fortune, he didn't just change how he spent his money. He changed his identity. For 50 years, he had been Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate. The man who controlled the infrastructure of America. The man who could crush competitors with a single decision. The man whose word moved markets. But the moment he sold the company, that identity disappeared. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was a retired millionaire. And there's a world of difference between those two things. A titan makes decisions that change the world. A retired millionaire writes checks. And Carnegie discovered that writing checks, no matter how large, doesn't feel the same as wielding power. So he retreated to Skibo Castle. And he tried to convince himself that this was the reward. That he had earned the right to spend his summers in a Scottish castle, playing golf, entertaining guests, and distributing his fortune. But here's what happened instead. The world moved on without him. The steel industry he had built continued without him. U.S. Steel, the company J.P. Morgan created from Carnegie's empire, kept growing. But Carnegie had no role in it. He had no influence over its decisions. He had sold not just his company, but his relevance. And relevance, it turns out, is harder to live without than money. Here's the financial mechanism that makes this inescapable. When Carnegie sold his company, he received the payment in bonds, not cash. Specifically, 5% gold bonds from U.S. Steel. That meant he received about $24 million per year in interest. An unimaginable fortune. But it also meant he was now dependent on U.S. Steel's continued success. The company he no longer controlled was now the source of his income. He had become a passive investor in his own legacy. And passive investors don't have power. They have exposure. If U.S. Steel succeeded, Carnegie's income continued. If it failed, his bonds would be worthless. But either way, he couldn't affect the outcome. He could only watch. That's not freedom. That's a different kind of prison. At Skibo Castle, Carnegie tried to build a new identity. He became the world's most famous philanthropist. He funded over 2,500 libraries across the English-speaking world. He established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He gave millions to universities, hospitals, research institutions. And every gift came with his name attached. Carnegie Library. Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Mellon University. He was building monuments to himself. But monuments are for dead people. Comment below if you've ever wondered what happens when legacy becomes a substitute for purpose. Here's the psychological mechanism at work. Carnegie had spent 50 years being necessary. He was the man who made decisions. Who solved problems. Who built the infrastructure of modern America. But after 1901, he was no longer necessary. The systems he had created were self-sustaining. The company ran without him. The industry evolved without his input. And his philanthropy, for all its scale, was essentially administrative. He had hired advisors to evaluate grant applications. They made recommendations. He approved them. But he wasn't building anything. He was just distributing capital he had already accumulated. And that distinction destroyed him. Because Carnegie's identity wasn't rooted in having wealth. It was rooted in creating wealth. In bending markets to his will. In outthinking competitors. In controlling the machinery of industry. When he sold the company, he didn't just sell his business. He sold the source of his identity. And no amount of philanthropy could replace it. At Skibo, he entertained guests. Wealthy industrialists, politicians, intellectuals. They came because Carnegie was famous. Because being invited to Skibo was prestigious. But here's what Carnegie slowly realized. They didn't come for his insights anymore. They came for the spectacle. For the castle. For the story they could tell about having met Andrew Carnegie. He had become a tourist attraction in his own life. And the more he tried to stay relevant, the more obvious his irrelevance became. He wrote books about democracy and peace. They sold because of his name, not because they contained original ideas. He gave speeches about international relations. People attended because he was Andrew Carnegie, not because he had expertise in diplomacy. He tried to mediate conflicts between nations. He failed. Because governments don't take direction from retired industrialists, no matter how wealthy they are. Here's the moment where the structure fails completely. In 1914, World War I began. Carnegie had spent over a decade funding peace initiatives. He had created the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace with $10 million. He had built the Peace Palace in The Hague. He had genuinely believed that his wealth could prevent war. And when war broke out anyway, it shattered him. Because that's when Carnegie understood the limits of his power. He could build libraries. He could endow universities. He could construct concert halls. But he couldn't change the fundamental trajectory of human behavior. His money could create infrastructure. But it couldn't create peace. And all the monuments bearing his name couldn't compensate for the fact that the world didn't need his permission to destroy itself. He spent the final years of World War I at Skibo, increasingly isolated. He stopped traveling. He stopped entertaining. He watched the world collapse into violence while his peace institutions proved useless. And here's the cruelest part. The steel his company had produced was now being used to manufacture weapons. The empire he had built was fueling the war his philanthropy had tried to prevent. That's not irony. That's structural failure. Carnegie had assumed that wealth gave him the power to shape history. But what he actually had was the power to shape infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't care about your intentions. It serves whoever controls it. And Carnegie didn't control it anymore. By 1918, Carnegie was 83 years old. The war had ended, but he was broken. He had given away over $350 million. He had built institutions that would last centuries. His name was carved into stone across 2 continents. But he was irrelevant. The industrialists who mattered were the ones still building companies. The philanthropists who mattered were the ones addressing current problems, not funding monuments to themselves. Carnegie died in August 1919 at his home in Massachusetts, not at Skibo. The castle he had built as his refuge had become a reminder of his displacement. He had sold his empire to buy freedom, but freedom turned out to be another word for obsolescence. If this is landing differently than you expected, it's because you're seeing the pattern now. Here's the question that should be disturbing you. Did Carnegie make a mistake? Should he have held on to his company? Should he have stayed in the fight instead of retreating to a castle? Or was his mistake deeper? Was it believing that wealth could be converted into something else without losing what made it powerful in the first place? Because here's the mechanism that defines this entire story. Power and wealth are not the same thing. Power is the ability to make decisions that other people have to live with. Wealth is accumulated capital. You can have wealth without power. Lottery winners have wealth. But they don't have power. And once Carnegie sold his company, he stopped having power. He became a wealthy man with nostalgia for the power he used to have. And nostalgia is a psychological trap. Because it prevents you from building a new identity. Carnegie spent his final 18 years trying to be relevant in the same way he had been relevant as an industrialist. He tried to make his philanthropy feel like empire building. He tried to make his peace initiatives feel like market domination. But they weren't the same. And the harder he tried to force the equivalence, the more obvious the difference became. Skibo Castle still exists. It's a private luxury hotel now. You can rent it for around $30,000 per night. The rooms where Carnegie entertained Rockefeller and Teddy Roosevelt are now available for weddings and corporate retreats. The estate that was supposed to be his crown jewel is now a venue. A backdrop. A piece of historical real estate that generates revenue by trading on Carnegie's name. That's what legacy looks like when you strip away the mythology. It's not immortality. It's real estate. It's institutions that outlast you but don't remember you as a person. It's libraries that bear your name but serve people who've never heard of you. Carnegie wanted his philanthropy to make him eternal. But what it actually did was turn him into a brand. And brands don't have feelings. They don't have purpose. They just exist. Here's what makes Carnegie's story different from other Gilded Age collapses. He didn't lose his money. He gave it away intentionally. He didn't die in poverty. He died in comfort. But he died having lost something more valuable than wealth. He lost necessity. He lost the feeling that the world needed him to make decisions. And for a man who had spent 50 years being indispensable, that loss was fatal in every way except the literal one. There's a letter Carnegie wrote near the end of his life to one of his few remaining close friends. It's not widely quoted because it doesn't fit the narrative of the benevolent philanthropist. He wrote, "I have been thinking about my life and I realize I made one mistake. I should never have sold. A man is not what he owns. He is what he does. And I have spent 18 years doing nothing that matters." That's the confession nobody wanted to hear from the world's greatest philanthropist. Because if Carnegie, the man who gave away more money than almost anyone in history, believed his philanthropy didn't matter, what does that say about the entire logic of billionaire generosity? Comment below if this is making you rethink what power actually means. Here's the final mechanism. Carnegie built his identity around control. He controlled steel production. He controlled labor. He controlled markets. And when he gave away his company, he assumed he could control his legacy the same way. He thought that by directing where his money went, he could shape how he would be remembered. But legacy doesn't work like that. Because legacy is decided by the people who come after you, not by the monuments you build. Carnegie is remembered today, but not the way he wanted to be. He's remembered as the industrialist who broke strikes, as the philanthropist who gave away his fortune, as a name on buildings. But he's not remembered as a person. His psychology, his regrets, his final years of irrelevance, that's not part of the story we tell. We remember the brand, not the man. And that's the cruelest outcome. Because Carnegie gave away his fortune to ensure he would be remembered. But what we remember is the fortune, not him. We remember Carnegie libraries, not Carnegie's loneliness. We remember Carnegie Hall, not Carnegie's obsolescence. The monuments survived. The men disappeared. If you've made it this far, you understand something most people never see about wealth and power. Share this if it changed how you think about what it actually means to win. Because Andrew Carnegie won everything. He accumulated more wealth than almost anyone in history. He gave it away to institutions that still exist today. His name is everywhere. But he spent his final years at a castle in Scotland, irrelevant to the world he had built, watching history move forward without him. He bought immortality. But immortality doesn't care about you. It just uses your name. And Skibo Castle, now a luxury hotel, is the perfect symbol of what happens when you confuse legacy with relevance. The building survived. The purpose didn't. And somewhere in that gap is the truth about what wealth can and cannot buy. And Skibo Castle, now a luxury hotel, is the perfect symbol of what happens when you confuse legacy with relevance. The building survived. The purpose didn't. And somewhere in that gap is the truth about what wealth can and cannot buy. There's another dimension to Carnegie's exile that makes it even more psychologically devastating. He didn't just lose his role in industry. He lost his peer group. Because here's what happens when you retire from empire building while everyone else is still building. You stop being a peer and become a relic. Rockefeller was still actively managing his oil empire and his philanthropic foundations. J.P. Morgan was still reshaping finance. Henry Ford was revolutionizing manufacturing. These men were still in the game. Still making decisions that moved markets. Still relevant. But Carnegie had removed himself from the field. And once you're off the field, you don't get invited to the strategy sessions anymore. You get invited to dinners. To ceremonial events. To ribbon cuttings at buildings that bear your name. And every one of those invitations is a reminder that you're no longer necessary. You're symbolic. And symbols don't have agency. Carnegie felt this acutely. His letters from the Skibo years reveal a man increasingly desperate to be consulted. He would write to former business associates offering advice they didn't ask for. He would propose strategies for problems that had already been solved without him. He would read about business developments in newspapers and write lengthy letters explaining what he would have done differently. But those letters were filed away, not acted upon. Because the world had moved on. Here's the mechanism that makes this pattern inescapable. When you build your identity entirely around your functional role, around what you do rather than who you are, retirement isn't freedom. It's erasure. Carnegie had never developed an identity separate from his role as an industrialist. He had no hobbies that weren't networking opportunities. No friendships that weren't strategic alliances. No interests that didn't connect back to business. So when the business was gone, there was nothing left except the performance of philanthropy. And performance is exhausting when you know it's not real. Carnegie would host elaborate gatherings at Skibo, inviting intellectuals and artists and politicians. He would lead discussions about philosophy and progress and the future of civilization. But he wasn't participating in those discussions as an equal. He was hosting them as a patron. And patronage is a fundamentally asymmetrical relationship. The patron provides resources. The guests provide entertainment and validation. But nobody is honest with the patron. Nobody tells the patron their ideas are outdated or their understanding is incomplete. They smile, they nod, they accept the hospitality, and they leave. Carnegie died believing he was still shaping intellectual discourse. But what he was actually doing was paying people to pretend his opinions mattered. That's not influence. That's theater. And the tragedy is that Carnegie was intelligent enough to know the difference. He just couldn't admit it. Because admitting it would mean admitting that selling his company had been a mistake. And he had spent 18 years justifying that decision to himself and the world. There's a specific moment that crystallizes this perfectly. In 1913, Carnegie was invited to testify before Congress about industrial relations. He was 77 years old. And he arrived expecting to be treated as an elder statesman of industry. As someone whose insights would shape policy. But that's not what happened. Instead, he was interrogated about the Homestead strike. About the violence his company had inflicted on workers 20 years earlier. About the contradiction between his philanthropic rhetoric and his industrial practices. And Carnegie had no good answers. He deflected. He claimed he hadn't been involved in the day-to-day decisions. He insisted that he had always supported workers' rights in principle. But the congressmen weren't interested in his principles. They were interested in his practices. And his practices had been ruthless. The hearing exposed something Carnegie had spent decades trying to hide. His philanthropy wasn't atonement. It was reputation management. And it wasn't working. He returned to Skibo after that hearing a diminished man. Because he had been forced to confront the fact that history wouldn't remember him the way he wanted to be remembered. He had given away hundreds of millions. He had built thousands of libraries. He had funded peace initiatives and educational institutions. But none of that could erase what he had done to accumulate the wealth in the first place. The blood was still on the money. And no amount of marble buildings could wash it off. This is the paradox that destroys philanthropists like Carnegie. They want credit for giving away wealth without accountability for how they acquired it. They want to be remembered for the libraries, not the strikes. For the concert halls, not the monopolies. For the generosity, not the violence. But history doesn't work that way. History remembers both. And the more you try to control your legacy, the more obvious your guilt becomes. Carnegie spent his final years increasingly isolated at Skibo. His wife Louise was there, but their relationship had always been more partnership than intimacy. His daughter Margaret was there, but she had her own life and little interest in her father's nostalgia. The guests kept coming, but they were performing for him as much as he was performing for them. Everyone at Skibo was playing a role. And when everyone is performing, nobody is real. He would walk the grounds of the estate, looking out over the Scottish Highlands, and try to convince himself this was what he had worked for. The peace. The beauty. The distance from the industrial violence that had made him rich. But distance isn't the same as escape. Because he carried the violence with him. In his memories. In his guilt. In the knowledge that everything he had built, the castle, the libraries, the foundations, rested on a foundation of brutality he could never quite acknowledge. When Carnegie died in 1919, the obituaries were respectful. They praised his philanthropy. They listed his gifts. They called him the patron saint of libraries. But they also mentioned Homestead. They also noted the contradiction. And in the years since, that contradiction has only become more obvious. We don't remember Carnegie as a saint. We remember him as a complicated man who tried to buy redemption and discovered that redemption isn't for sale. Skibo Castle stands as the physical manifestation of that failed transaction. It's beautiful. It's historic. It's worth millions. But it's empty of meaning. It's a luxury hotel where wealthy people vacation. Where they sleep in Carnegie's bedroom and eat in his dining room and walk his grounds without thinking about what any of it meant to him. The building survived. But everything Carnegie wanted it to represent, his triumph, his wisdom, his lasting relevance, died with him. That's the final lesson. You can buy monuments. You can fund institutions. You can carve your name into stone and marble and bronze. But you can't buy meaning. Meaning comes from connection, from purpose, from being necessary to something larger than yourself. And when Carnegie sold his company and retreated to Skibo, he severed those connections. He bought isolation and called it peace. He bought irrelevance and called it legacy. And he spent 18 years discovering that the trade had ruined him. The castle still stands. But the men who built it disappeared long before he died.